Hey BookTube, it's Angie. If the camera picks up some wheezing noise in the back, I don't think it will because he's down the hall, but if it does, that's the bulldog in the back. And I'm hoping that the camera is going to stay put all right for this video. Yesterday, my excitable Labrador ended up busting the portion of my tripod that actually holds my camera. So I had to do some super glue work to it. I'm hoping it's going to hold. So we'll just have to see. This video, as you might have seen by the title, is a Holocaust theme video. I've had these books set aside for a while. These are all middle grade, bordering on YA fiction that all have Holocaust themes to them. The reason I had it sitting for a while is I didn't know how to do a video about it that felt natural. What I mean by that is the Holocaust is one of those topics that's hard to bring up without pretext, without weirding people out. It's kind of like 9/11 or something. Like, you can't go to a party or something and say, hey, how about that Holocaust? It feels more natural if there's something that helps you introduce the topic, at least in my experience. So I was sent a couple of these books for review. I had some of these on my shelves. So I had the idea to put all of these together in a themed video, but it was one of those ones that I didn't know how to just like stick out there and not have viewers go, okay, it seems like that's out of nowhere, all right. What ended up helping me out was that for 2018, this week, well, it's closing now since I'm filming this on Sunday, but this week marks the Holocaust Remembrance Week. April 12th was actually Holocaust Remembrance Day for 2018. It moves around a little bit depending on the Jewish calendar of observances, but for this year it fell on, the Remembrance Day fell on April 12th. So the rest of it was Remembrance Week. So I figured with that in mind, I would go ahead and do this video and talk about some of these middle grade fiction Holocaust themed books, because there are some really good books in here to check out. I don't think I rated anything in here lower than a 3 or a 3.5. I don't think I had any dud books in this pile, so a lot of good reading in here. So I'm just gonna start. I'm gonna sit down though because got a bit of a stack. And again, because I'm a shorty, to bring this down just a hair. And this is making me nervous because of this fragile tripod now. Okay. Alright, so the first one to start, let me take my notes off of it so I remember what to talk about, is It Night or Day? This is by Fern Schumer Chapman. And this one is kind of unique because this is one that talks a little bit about a side of World War II and the Holocaust that doesn't get a lot of attention, or doesn't get as much as it probably should, and that's the whole topic of the children that were transported out of areas of Europe that were becoming Nazi-controlled areas that had persecuted Jews, that had families that were trying to get their kids out before they were sent to the camps. There were a few projects around the world that were trying very desperately to get as many children out of those areas as possible. I think one such project was, I know there was, I think it was called Kinder Transport, which moved children to Britain, but that project became very heavily saturated very quickly, as you can imagine. So there was another one that I think was called the 1,000 Children Project that moved kids to the US as much as possible, and Fern Schumer Chapman was actually inspired by her mother's story as one of those children in the 1,000 Children Project. So she took her mother's experiences that she grew up hearing and wrote this fictionalized version, or inspired by her mother's account. And this one doesn't talk about the 1,000 Children Project so much. It's just Chapman mentioned it at the beginning that there is some inspiration there, which I'll just, before I get into the story itself, I'll just go ahead and read you what she has to say in her author's note at the very beginning. In 1938, my grandparents, sensing the growing anti-Semitism in Germany, sent my mother, Edith Westerfeld, to live in America all by herself. She was only 12 years old. She was part of an American rescue operation later named the 1,000 Children, which sought to place child refugees in foster families to escape Nazi persecution. The children knew little of what was happening to them, and my mother would not know her whole story until she was 77 years old. Giving voice to my mother and other Holocaust survivors has become a significant part of my life's work. In trying to understand my own identity, I have patched together my mother's story bit by bit. Is It Night or Day is a work of historical fiction. In writing this novel, I have imagined my mother's voice and recounted some of her experiences, along with those of other children who escaped the Holocaust by coming to America. So like I said, somewhat inspired by her mother's experiences, but not a direct account. But this has to do with a girl who, I want to say she's in the 12, 13-year-old range. I think she starts the story as a 12-year-old, if I remember right, and has her 13th birthday later on, I think. But the main character is also named Edith, and she starts out the story talking about how she's grown up in this town of Stockstadt, Germany, which is just outside Frankfurt, to my understanding. I haven't been there, but I think that's what the book mentions, it's just outside Frankfurt. And her family had lived in that town for 2 centuries without really any issue. Even in her early years, she talks about growing up in a very safe, sheltered, loving environment. And then once World War II comes about and Hitler comes into power, all of a sudden, all of these neighbors that were maybe closeted anti-Semitists, they come out, and all of a sudden living in this community is just hell for anybody who's known to be Jewish. Going to the grocery store, going to the movies, even going to the community pool, like everything is wrought with fear and discomfort about their surroundings that was once their home, but now they're feeling very alienated. So Edith's family makes the choice that they should all move to the US to start over. Edith's sister had already gone over there a little bit earlier and had set up with a foster family. So her parents make plans for them and her to go over there as well. But her parents discover that they don't have permission to go over there, so they have to send Edith by herself. And she talks about going through Ellis Island in New York and all of that, and then eventually settling in Chicago with her her uncle Jacob and his wife Mildred. And it's immediately uncomfortable for Edith because Mildred seems to have this strong hatred for anything that reeks of German culture. Even her own husband, who is German, Mildred makes everybody call him Uncle Jack instead of Jacob. And she doesn't like having German-themed things in the house. She acts very resentful about having Edith in the home. She feels like it brings down her social standing a little bit, but she also kind of reworks it a little bit to say, oh, I'm doing this great charitable thing by bringing her into my house. But as soon as Edith comes into the house, Mildred starts treating her almost like a house servant rather than a niece. Mildred gives Edith this long laundry list of things that she expects Edith to clean every day, and instead of giving Edith her own room, because you can imagine like coming from this long history of living in Germany to suddenly coming to America and not speaking English, not knowing anything about American culture, nothing. You can imagine how how much of a culture shock that is for any immigrant. So you would think, as a way to sort of soften the shock of that, it would be a nice transition to give somebody their own space, their own room, and something that they can call theirs so that they can ease into this new life gradually. But no, as soon as Edith gets there, she finds out she doesn't have a room. She's forced to sleep on the living room couch where everybody is in and out and making her feel like she's part of the furniture. And then Mildred also tells her that there will be no snacks in between meals, there will be no socializing in the house. Mildred is very verbally abusive to Edith. Edith's uncle Jacob he's largely unaware of what's going on because he's at work all the time. But Edith feels like her parents have worked so hard to get her to this point, to this place of safety, that she feels like she just has to make the best of it, however bad it seems. So she just tries to brush it off and just get through her days. But then on top of what's going on at home, she's also going to school and getting ridiculed for being an immigrant there, and getting teased a lot for her limited English. But the longer she's in school, the more she realizes she actually picks up languages pretty quickly. So she picks up English pretty fast, and they start her in kindergarten class when she first comes in, even though she's a teenager, because she doesn't speak any English. But because she picks up languages so quick, she's in her own grade within a few months. But one of the things they talk about in this story that I thought was odd, they mention, I think it's when she's in one of the lower grades, like first or second grade, they talk about her immediately being pushed into doing the Pledge of Allegiance, which I thought was a little bit weird, because I'm like, she's an immigrant, maybe like not force that on her right away. It's like, yes, like American children who are born here, we're indoctrinated with doing that from the moment we start school. But as an immigrant, I feel like, you know, maybe not put that on them like the day they get here. Maybe like have them learn a little bit about the country first. I don't know, that's just my mind. But the thing I thought was weird is they described Edith going through the Pledge of Allegiance, but they describe it as her being triggered because the children were doing it with their hand out, much like the Nazi salute, and it brought back bad memories for her. But I was thinking, never once in any of my school days did we ever do the Pledge of Allegiance that way. I don't know if that was an older way to do it, but every day that I had to, I mean, I stopped having to do it, I think, around 5th grade. They don't really ask you to do it, at least in the Southern California school system. They don't really ask you to do it after like 6th, 7th grade, I think. But my earlier years, it was the same thing every day from like kindergarten to 5th grade. Every teacher I had said it the exact same way. You would come into class at the beginning of the day, and that was the very first thing you did. And every teacher in every tone of voice, it was always said the same way. They would say, hand over your heart, ready, begin. And you would say the pledge. So yeah, it was always hand over your heart, like, you know, when the Star Spangled Banner plays or something. Is just, I've never heard of the arm being held straight out. So I thought that was a little weird, but I could understand why that would be triggering for her. So a lot of this book has to do with Edith's immigrant experience and her struggle with feeling a lot of guilt and confusion about her new situation, because she you go through this teenage experience of her going through her first dance and having her first boy crush and developing her first American friends and all that, and she feels guilty because she's having these moments of happiness when she's thinking of her parents still in Germany and what they must be going through. So she feels like she shouldn't be happy about these things, or she's dishonoring them somehow by having feelings of contentment. And then when they talk about her school years, when they say that she's doing well in school and learning all kinds of things and enjoying that, again, she feels guilt because she feels like if she does well in American schools, is that disrespecting her German culture? Which, when she goes to meet her sister Betty, who, like I said, had gone to America a little bit before her, when her and her sister meet up, her sister just completely embraces American life and just, almost like Mildred does, drops everything German and encourages Edith to do the same. She's like, yeah, no, stop speaking German as soon as possible, and, you know, stop eating so much German food. Like, you know, this is what you should wear, and this is the music they like here, and yeah, to embrace it, take it. This is your new life. And you just is sort of taken aback by this because she feels like that's just cutting all ties with her parents. So it's like most of the story is her trying to find that balance of how do I take on this new life where I'm safe but also honor my roots kind of thing. So this one, it's more of the immigrant story rather than the war in Germany and all that itself, which I think is also still an important story to see, you know, the transplant experience and what that did to people, the breaking up of families. It's still an important story to hear. So then there's also a thing in the back I thought I would share after the story, the afterword, as it were, where Chapman gives you a little bit more explanation about the time period and what all this meant. And she says, "What is left when a child has everything taken away? Their home, family, language, loyalties, identity. Only the story remains." Until recently, most Americans knew nothing of the role the United States played in saving European Jewish children from the Nazis. In 2000, after seeing a documentary about England's Kindertransport program, which saved 10,000 European children, two American women, Iris Posner and Lenore Moskowitz, became curious about their country's part in rescuing the youngest victims of Nazi persecution. As they began their research, they discovered a forgotten American rescue operation organized by Lutherans, Quakers, and Jews that took place from 1934 to 1945. Children ranging in age from 14 months to 16 years old entered the U.S. in small groups, averaging about a dozen a month, roughly 100 a year. Ultimately, these American volunteers saved 1,200 children. Although these children were legal immigrants, they were not always greeted warmly in their new homeland, as this was the time of restrictive American immigration policies and widespread anti-Semitism. Sound familiar? Children were sent to live in cities across the country and often were forced to assimilate quickly into American culture. Consequently, most of them never felt a sense of cohesiveness as a group. Posner, the founder of the 1,000 Children Foundation, believes that the circumstances of their journey and subsequent assimilation resulted in the lack of a collective identity among these children. About 250 of the 800 surviving children, now in their 70s or 80s, came to the first reunion for the 1,000 children held in Chicago in 2002. Most, like my mother, had no idea of how they had been brought to America. No one knew they had been part of a larger rescue effort. Posner told the group, "You will not find these stories in history books." The stories of other immigrant children often aren't featured in history books either. For many reasons, war, famine, political persecution, economic hardship, natural disasters, children have been painfully separated from their parents and forced to find a new life. These drastic uprootings cast these young people adrift, even as they are rescued. Most recently, more than 27,000 child refugees have fled the Sudanese civil war to come to America. In 2001, 3 lost boys, as they are called, arrived in the Minneapolis airport one January evening after a 3-day journey from Africa, where they had suffered through homelessness, lion attacks, and tribal wars. Immediately, the boys found themselves in a new world full of white faces, overhead lighting, moving walkways, flushing toilets, and blaring televisions. The New York Magazine reported that one of the boys looked out the airport window at the swirling white snow against the dark gray sky, and he asked the church caseworker, "Excuse me, can you tell me please now, is it night or day?" So that is that one. Just one unique aspect of the Holocaust story. Then we move on to Escape in Time. This is one of the ones I was sent for review by, I think it was MB Publishing. So thank you guys for let me try this out. This is a lot of these in this collection are inspired. The authors were inspired by family members or people they knew. This one, it says on the back, is based upon actual memoirs, though it is a fiction. This has to do with this 12-year-old Nezia, I think her name is. I think that's how you pronounce it. And Nezia doesn't really know much about her grandmother's Holocaust story. So when Nezia hits about 12 years old, her grandmother Miri decides to write out her experience because Miri says I think I can get it out easier if I write it down rather than saying it out loud. Just a little book. So that's largely what this is you get the story of Miri through this written down story that you're basically reading with Nezia. And in Miri's story, readers are given a more specific idea of what life was like just prior to Jewish prisoners being sent to the concentration camps when they were still in their communities, but often in sort of a police state. There are stories in here of curfews, mandatory curfews being enacted, the citizens having to wear yellow circles on their clothes, which were the precursors to the yellow stars, indicating that they were Jewish citizens. The Jewish stars they had to wear in the concentration camps, the yellow circles were the precursors to that, so there's talk of that. Miri talks about business owners in her community having their licenses revoked so that they didn't have a way to feed their families. It's also a little bit hard to take in parts because there are stories about these people being driven so far into starvation that there's one depiction of one family chopping up a dead horse because if they didn't eat the horse, they were all going to die of starvation themselves. So yeah, if you're sensitive, there are a few spots in here that get a little grim. This one's not too bad though, as far as how it could have been. Miri also talks about children having to learn how to speak and write in code when they wanted to communicate with their families or friends without Germans knowing what they were talking about. So they kind of have to develop their own coded language between each other to keep secrets safe. That's just within the communities that they're living in. And then there's the transition into the Jewish ghettos, where a lot of the families were moved from pretty nice, clean communities and neighborhoods into these cramped, squalid ghettos. Like in Miri's case, she talks about how her family was put in with 3 other families, entire families. So 4 families into one bedroom apartment. And you can just imagine that multiplied by multiple apartment buildings. And that would be these cramped Jewish ghettos. So you get little scenes of that. And remember, these are all geared towards younger readers. So I think it's good that it's introduced that way, these little gradual bits, because you can imagine when when younger readers grow up and they read more extensive documents and real life accounts of people that survived the Holocaust, they're going to think back to this and have that much more foundation for the real life experiences they're going to read. She talks about that, and then also just the lengths people would go to try to escape German capture, the complex plans that people would try to plot out, the fake IDs, the extensive false alibis that they would get other people involved in to say, oh yeah, say I was over here, or say I'm related to you, and just anything to try to escape persecution. It was just a really desperate time, a really scared, fearful time. One of the things that I thought this one did really nicely was there's an element in here that makes you realize that it's easy to judge people and their decisions in the past when you're sitting from the comfort of present day, when you are basically living off of the benefit of what came before you. It's easy to sit here and say, well, that was a stupid decision, or why would you do that? And I think that's one thing that is really nicely illustrated in this little story. One of the visuals that stuck out to me especially was Nezia is at one point reading this story of her grandmother and being really emotionally upset by it, but at the same time it's written in that her mother comes in with a plate of cookies and lemonade, and so she's sitting there eating cookies and lemonade and being sad about her mother's story, which I think just that visual together kind of brought home that idea that you're comfortable where you are. Maybe not be so harsh on people that had to make much harder decisions than you've had to. So yeah, it brings home a lot of important ideas, but in a very gentle, quiet, but still interesting and easily readable way. So I really liked this one. And also it has some really nice pencil illustrations. These are done by Lori McGaw. There's another one in here, you know, like but they're very nice and lifelike looking. I mean, they're pretty intricate once you get to looking at them. There's a pronunciation guide at the beginning of this for some of the towns and I think foods and things or names that might confuse you. They give you a list there of how to properly say them, which I thought was cool. So there is that one. Really liked that one. The one thing I would say about this book, though, to keep in mind is there were parts in here that did suffer a little bit for my reading experience, that is, where I think maybe it just suffered from having all of these historical facts that you want to get to the reader, and you're trying to write this story around it to make it interesting. But there were passages in here that read a little bit more textbook than novel when they got really caught up in statistics, which it would be fine if it was a nonfiction book, but when I'm reading a fiction book, it sort of took me out of the story every once in a while when it got really heavily into number crunching. So just something to keep in mind when I was reading that. And then we have this classic, which I'm sure a lot of people in school have read by now. But this is Number of the Stars by Lois Lowry. This is just a simple little story that, you know, reads really quick. You can do this in probably a couple hours, an afternoon. It's super short. But this has to do with this girl, Anne-Marie, and her best friend, Ellen, who are living in Denmark in, what was the year? 1943. And Anne-Marie's family isn't Jewish, but Ellen's family is. In order to keep Ellen safe, the decision is made that she will move in with Anne-Marie's family and pose as Anne-Marie's deceased sister. Anne-Marie had a sister that passed away early in life, and the deceased sister and Ellen are close enough in age that the families feel like it could be pulled off if the Germans ask questions. So Ellen moves in with Anne-Marie, and then it's basically the story of how with this family, the lengths they go to keep Ellen safe. This one is inspired by the true story of Lois Lowry's real friend, Annalise Pratt, who also grew up in Denmark, I believe. The story here was good. It wasn't quite as riveting as some of the other ones I've read, but one thing I did like about this one is it does tell the story in small part of the Danish involvement in World War II, which is something that, again, I don't think gets mentioned all that much in history books. I mean, you typically hear about, you know, the Japanese involvement and Italy and Germany and those areas, but you don't really hear about places like Denmark or even Africa's involvement, though they were. It's on a lesser scale, and you know, being of Danish heritage myself, it was kind of interesting to have something that talks about you know, my people's involvement in all that. At one point, they do discuss the movement of Danish Jews to Sweden for protection, which I didn't know a lot about that story. So when I read about that, I ended up going online and reading up more about that, which I thought was interesting. So that is that one. There's also kind of a sad story in there where they talk about the Danish Navy blowing up their own shipyards just so they could do it before the Germans got to them, which ties into the family. I think it's Anne-Marie's sister is getting ready to have a 5th 5th birthday, I think it was, and she gets scared by the sound of this shipyard being blown up, and her mother was like, oh no, that's just they're setting off fireworks for your birthday, and like trying to downplay it, which that whole scene just made me a little sad. Moving right along, we have sorry, there's a sticky on here, those one come off. We have The Devil's Arithmetic by Jane Yolen. Again, pretty well read. I don't know if it's as well read as Number of the Stars. I don't know if this one comes out quite as much, but still really good. This one is interesting because it works in time travel, which is unexpected. But basically this is the story of Hannah, who is, I think she's, again, 12. And she's, for all these years, she's gone with her family to her grandmother's house for Passover Seder dinner. And she's just at that age where she's burnt out and bored with having to do this every year and going through the same rituals and same prayers and everything every year. And there's a tradition in her family that, or part of the Passover Seder tradition, that is, where someone is picked every year to go to the door and open the door and symbolically welcome in the prophet Elijah. And at the beginning of this story, Hannah's turn is this year. Her grandmother decides it's going to be her. And Hannah does the, preteen teenager thing of grudgingly getting up and stomping over to the door and like opening it. But the minute she opens the door, she is transported back to, I think it's 1942 Poland, I want to say. Yes, 1942 Poland, where everybody there seems to recognize her, but they keep calling her, I think it's pronounced Haya. It's spelled Chaya, but I think it's like Haya. I think there's supposed to be sort of a guttural H to it, sort of like challah bread or Hanukkah, which are all spelled with CHs. But I guess if you want to call her Chaya, I've known other people that go by that name. So it's whatever you read it as, but that's the name they recognize her as, which turns out to be Hannah's Hebrew name that she was given in honor of one of her aunt's deceased friends. She's a little bit confused by everything, naturally, because she's like, what just happened? And at first she thinks it's just this really ornate prank that her family carried out to get her back for being moody or something. But everybody else seems like really dedicated to their roles, that this is a prank. They do mention that the people that Hannah interacts with in this year of 1942 in Poland, they do act like she's acting weird, but they mention that they're just going to shrug it off because apparently she had recently lost her parents in a cholera epidemic, and she had contracted the cholera herself, and the cholera had damn near killed her. So they're like, you're probably just still off from all of that, so we're gonna let this weird behavior go. And it takes Hannah a while, but then she starts to realize what exactly happened. That it's not a prank, that somehow she is in this time period. And so she takes it upon herself to try to warn all these people, because, she's coming from what would be her modern day and living with all of these lessons that you learn in school from what happened at the Holocaust. So she's trying to run around telling people what's going to happen, and they need to hide, they need to protect themselves, and pack up your stuff and get out of town. And all these people are like, oh, you're being crazy. Like, who would be that evil? This is silliness. No, it's going to blow over. It's going to be fine. And of course, it's not fine. By now we're well aware of what happened to those people. And in this story, Hannah gets taken up with them. She has to board the trains herself, and she has to go through the whole Holocaust experience herself. Even though she's a girl from modern times, she experiences everything she's ever heard from her grandmother's point of view that she never really took that seriously before. And she's doing it under this assumed identity that people recognize her as the Chaya. So it's a pretty this one is surprisingly pretty painful to get through. When you think about it being written for a middle grade audience, incorporating the time travel, all that, you'd think it would maybe be downplayed a little bit for younger readers, but no, this one doesn't really hold back that much. There's a scene near the end that even as a grown adult I was tearing up at because of just the sheer selflessness and the choice that Hannah has to make in that time period, and the people she has to see suffer and starve to death and be beaten and murdered and all these things. It's pretty grim, but again, really good. Jane Yolen writes at the back in her afterword, "The unnamed camp I have written about here did not exist. Rather, it is an amalgam of the camps that did. Auschwitz, with its ironic sign, Arbeit macht frei, was the worst of them, where in 2.5 years 2 million Jews and 2 million Soviet prisoners of war, Polish political prisoners, gypsies, and European non-Jews were gassed. Treblinka, where 840,000 Jews were killed. Chelmno, with its total of 360,000 Jews. Sobibor, with 250,000. There were also other camps, and their count is the devil's arithmetic indeed," which they do explain what that means in this book. Belzec, Majdanek, Dachau, Birkenau, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Mauthausen, Ravensbrück. The toll is endless and anonymous. Whole families, whole villages, whole countrysides disappeared. At the time of the Holocaust, it seemed impossible to imagine, for the scale of slaughter was difficult to grasp. Today, a lifetime later, we can echo Winston Churchill, who wrote, "There is no doubt that this is probably the greatest and most horrible single crime ever committed in the whole history of the world. And yet it is still impossible, unimaginable, difficult to grasp." Even with the facts in front of us, the numbers, the indelible photographs, the autobiographies, the wrists still bearing the long numbers, there are people in the world who deny such things ever happened. After all, how can we believe that human beings like ourselves, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, could visit upon their fellow humans such programmed misery, such a routine of torture, all couched in the language of manufacture, so many units delivered, operating at full capacity? These were not camps, even though they were called so. They were factories designed for the effective murder of human beings. There is no way that fiction can come close to touching upon how truly inhuman, alien, even satanic was the efficient machinery of deaths at these camps, nor how heroism had to be counted not in resistance, which was worse than useless because it meant involving the deaths of even more innocents. Not to act, Emanuel Ringelblum, a Jewish historian of the Holocaust, has written, "Not to lift a hand against the Germans had become the quiet, passive heroism of the common Jew. That heroism, to resist being dehumanized, to simply outlive one's tormentors, to practice the quiet, everyday caring for one's equally tormented neighbors, to witness, to remember, those were the only victories of these camps." Fiction cannot recite the numbing numbers, but it can be that witness, that memory. A storyteller can attempt to tell the human tale, can make a galaxy out of the chaos, can point to the fact that some people survived even though most people didn't, and can remind us that the swallows still sing around the smokestacks. I would also recommend, if you haven't seen it, there was a pretty good movie adaptation of this book where Kirsten Dunst plays Hannah, which, if you watch the beginning of the movie, I will say the beginning of the movie looks kind of low tech and you're probably going to be like, what is this? But stick with it, and it's actually a really well done adaptation of this. Then we have Guardian Angel by William Macaulay, I think it is. I'll have to put in an insert because this was the other one that was sent to me for review, but I was sent an ebook to review, so we'll have to work with the graphic here. This one is similar a little bit to Devil's Arithmetic in that it has to do with a young boy, teenage boy, or, you know, I guess I should say Devil's Arithmetic, it was a teenage girl, and this one it's a teenage boy. But teenager getting to know their grandparent a little bit better. through their Holocaust story. This one doesn't involve time travel though. Some of the themes are similar though, but I will say that even though they deal with a similar topic and similar themes and age group and all of that, they are both very unique in their storytelling of this theme. So it's just some similarities. But anyway, babbling on. Guardian Angel has to do with Marcus, who is 13 years old. Marcus has had a little bit of a hard time in recent years because he's always been teased at school for being a ginger. But now, because he's starting into puberty, on top of being a ginger, he's also struggling with his voice cracking. So it hasn't been the easiest social environment for him at school, but when the Holocaust unit in history class gets started up in his grade, there's a group of popular kids that seem to know that he has a grandmother who is a Holocaust survivor, and they say, oh, well, you know, you can join our group and maybe your grandmother can help us get a good grade on our group, kind of thing. So Marcus gets really excited because he's like, oh, it's my in to get in with the cool kids, and you know, maybe I can save my social reputation around here. So he goes to his grandmother, who prior to this, he hadn't really been that interested in her story. He'd heard bits of it every now and then. He knew she had facial scarring on one side of her face. She looked like she has a burn on one side. But a lot of times whenever the topic is broached, she gets very hesitant, or she'll change the conversation real quick. But because this is his in with the cool kids, he goes to her, and she lives in a nursing home. And he basically starts having visits with her, kind of like, I mean, he's visiting his grandmother like, you know, any grandkid would, but it's more played up, it's more buttered up, because he's sort of prepping her for talking about the Holocaust details. And it's going well. He's asking questions little by little, and she's answering it here and there. And then he presents a question to her that has to directly do with Auschwitz, and she just goes off the wall. You know, she just goes crazy with this very visceral response to being asked this question. And in her grandmotherly way, she basically tells him to get the hell out of here. And she doesn't want to talk about it again after that, until he finds out that there is a kid in class who's going to do his Holocaust project from the point of view of a Holocaust denier, who is basically someone who says that the Holocaust never happened, it was a propaganda scheme. And there are people that believe that. I'm sure I will get a few of them on this video if they find this. Because I know, prepping for this video, I've watched a few Holocaust documentaries and topic videos and things like that, and I've seen them on almost every one. Someone will come in and say, I can't believe you buy this crap. So yeah, deniers, welcome. Hopefully you learned something. You probably won't. But anyway, Marcus has a guy in his class that wants to do it from that angle, and he goes to his grandmother and tells her, and all of a sudden her attitude changes and says, oh, hell no. All right, we're going to talk about my story then, if these people want to pretend that this didn't happen. And so that gets her kind of fired up. And while they're doing this project and gathering information and having these talks and stuff, Marcus also goes online and finds this Holocaust survivor support group forum type thing. And he gets the idea of, well, maybe if I get the word out there, maybe I can track down somebody who knew her during those years and can sort of give that much extra validation to her story and say, oh, see, this is another person that can back it up. So it starts off well enough, but then the story progresses where this guy ends up showing up at the nursing home claiming that he knows Sarah, the grandmother, and remembers her from Auschwitz. And then things happen, and the story gets back to the FBI, of all people, and FBI agents are sent out, and there's an investigation started because there's suspicion that Sarah hasn't been upfront about her background, that there's some incriminating evidence against her that needs to be answered to, and because there's no statute of limitations on war crimes, it's pretty serious what they bring in front of her. And then once all this is going on, then the media picks up the story, and the media reports their spin on it of what's going on, and then people at home hear it, and then there are protesters outside of Sarah's nursing home picketing and saying that their beautiful town is harboring war criminals. And so the reader gets this sense that you're only getting little portions of the story, and I feel like there are facts missing here. And so one of the things I liked about this story is that it not only talks about the idea of the importance of learning history so you don't repeat it, and educating yourself and all of those things, but it also has this sort of side lesson in the dangers of media spin and being caught up in putting belief in what you're hearing versus what you know in your soul to be true. Just because you have so many people saying one thing doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It just means there's hype around it. And when you put faith or value on the wrong type of thing, the wrong type of hype, it can actually be detrimental to people's lives. It can be almost irreversibly damaging if you put strength in the wrong thing and give credence to misguided or half-truths, that kind of thing. So I like that idea was brought into a middle grade level story so that you can get young readers thinking about that right away. I saw evidence of this in my own home recently. My husband came home from a call. He came home from a suicide call recently where he told me the details. He was on the call himself. He told me the details of what it was because he was like, it was disturbing what we came up on. He didn't, give me names or anything like that. It was, very anonymously based, but told me what happened, and I was like, oh my God, because it was pretty like mind-blowing what this person, the lengths they went to end their life. It was like a multiple step thing. And he said, even when we got on site, we were scratching our heads. Well, the next day, he and I are sitting on the couch and the news came on, and they reported this story that he was on. And a large portion of the story he told me was left off of the news. And he was like, huh, that's a very watered down version of what happened. And I was like, I'm guessing because, they're giving it in palatable portions. If they told the whole story, people would probably have the reaction I did, and the reaction he and the other guys did at the site were like, oh my God, because it was pretty bad. But it was interesting to have that personal experience where, you have somebody that was there that can show you documentation of what happened, but then the news report comes on and you're like, yeah, that's only like a fraction of what happened. And it gave a very different feel to the situation as a whole. So it gives you something to think about media spin, because I think that is a topic that is becoming more and more important with the administration we have now. There is a hell of a lot more spin, a hell of a lot more damage control going on than maybe in previous years. So it is something you definitely want young readers to start thinking about, because it's probably not going to go away anytime soon. The other thing I wanted to mention about this book that comes up in Sarah's story that I thought was really important is Sarah's story gives this, when she's talking about her number that is tattooed on her, one of the important things she teaches Marcus her grandson that I think a lot of young readers need to hear, and possibly adult readers who may be forgotten, is Sarah impresses upon him the idea that having that identification number is not identity itself. It has nothing to do with your soul's identity. I was trying to think how this might translate to a general reader, someone who doesn't have a Jewish background or a Holocaust story from a relative that they can fall back on. The other idea I came upon was the idea of in the US we have social security numbers. From the time you're born in the US, you were given a social security number, or at least you should have one. And obviously it's not quite on the same scale because it's not tattooed into us, but that was the closest relational thing I could think of at the time. But it's kind of a similar idea. You're given that social security number from the time you're born, but it has nothing to do with who you are on a day-to-day basis. I have my social security number that I bring out for, when I have to fill out medical forms or go to the DMV or, basically any sort of government or city-based important documentation kind of thing. It comes up. But other than that, I don't think about my social security number. It has nothing to do with my education, my family. It has nothing to do with my life experiences, my passions, my dislikes. It has nothing to do with any of that. And she tries to press upon him that idea with the tattoo. She talks about how the important thing to remember is it's what you do with your life that makes your identity. It has nothing to do with any sort of number somebody gives you in order to make you sort of mass-produced kind of feeling, part of the crowd, easily forgettable. Don't put any basis in that. Know that your identity comes from your moral code, what you do with your life, how you treat people, that kind of thing. Those are the things to put value in, which I think, again, that's something that young readers need to know, and maybe even adult readers need to be reminded of. So, closing out this this video, which might be kind of long, but like I said, there's a lot of good reads in here to cover, but this is the last one. I have the graphic novel Mouse. This is the complete Mouse. This has the whole story, volumes 1 and 2 in it. This is the 25th anniversary edition. And this is another one where it's inspired by people the author knew. In this case, Art Spiegelman is, sorry, just throw that on the other. Art Spiegelman is doing a sort of fictionalized version of his parents' story who survived the Holocaust. It can be a little bit tricky to explain to somebody because it's partially fictionalized, but you recognize that he is writing himself in the story, but kind of as a character. But then there's also a part towards the middle of the book where Art Spiegelman, the author, comes in and does this separate panel where he talks about his real mother's suicide and how that affected him. But most of the story is told through this sort of fictionalized version of Spiegelman's character, where the character is still a cartoonist who goes to he's a grown man, and he goes to his father, who is a Holocaust survivor, and he presents him with the idea of, hey, maybe we should get your story down once and for all and have it in print. And at first his dad's like, why would you want to do that? But he kind of sells his dad on the idea as it goes on. So we meet Vladek, who is the Holocaust survivor in this book. I don't know if Spiegelman decided to do this to sort of soften the blow of some of the topics he was going to talk about, but he chose to tell the story using animals. Let's see if I can find a panel that'll show you. Here's one. You can kind of see it here. So you see there we go. The Nazis are portrayed as cats. The Jewish people are portrayed as mice. There are other panels in here where medical staff are portrayed as pigs. There's one character in here who is African American, who is, or I think African American, maybe just African, I can't remember now. But he's portrayed as a black dog. So I don't know if that was to soften the topic a little bit, because otherwise Spiegelman does not hold back. There is a lot of gritty material in here. This graphic novel is definitely not for the faint of heart. There are images in here of mice with nooses around their necks. There's a story in here about mice children who are crying and giving away the location of their families and hiding, and when they're found, the children are swung by their legs into brick walls. There are images of mice who are in flames. That's just some of it. There are panels in here that graphically describe the interiors of the gas chambers. So yeah, it's not lighthearted for the most part, at least when you hear like the details of Vladek's story. Spiegelman again does soften it a little bit with the older version of Vladek, who is, you know, when he's an old man and he's talking to his son. They're just sitting at the kitchen table having conversations. There's sort of that like father-son banter where Vladek is kind of like playfully giving his son crap about things in his life. So there's a little bit humor interjected in there. There's one story in here of this when Vladek is talking about this girl that he met prior to meeting his son's mother. I think her name is Lucia. Picture I think I included in my written review, which I'll link the written reviews to all these down below. But it's this story of, I don't know if it was meant to be comedic, but I found it kind of scary, funny. But Lucia is someone that Vladek was kind of seeing before he met his son's mother, and then once he sort of breaks it to Lucia that he's sort of interested in somebody else, she goes full on stage 5 clinger. And just, it's kind of funny, but also like the level she goes to gets a little bit scary. So there are moments here and there interjected where it's a little bit more lighthearted. There's also some side story of Vladek and his son where it focuses more on like their father-son relationship and the things the son went through growing up and him trying to understand his father now. Those passages that I mean, they have the Holocaust tie to them, but it's more like their personal relationship and the things they went through that are just, they're not like gritty, or they're heavy in their own way, but it's, again, it serves as sort of a little bit of a tension release from the heavier elements of the Holocaust panels. The Holocaust story starts mainly with Vladek talking about meeting his wife Anya and their early years prior to the war really taking off. He talks about his first son being born and Anya quickly falling into postpartum depression after that. And Anya actually came from millionaire parents, so prior to the Nazi occupation, they had the means to send her to this sort of fancy sanitarium in Czechoslovakia, I think. But it was there that Anya ran into her first experience of just full-on anti-Semitism that she was not expecting, which you can imagine that combined with, you know, you're already in a postpartum depression state. It kind of broke her a little bit. So there's a pretty sad story attached to that. And then Vladek is talking about his own experience of what he had to do to survive. One of the things talking about how he, I think they said he was of Polish descent. I want to say his family was from Poland, but because Vlada could write and speak in German, he got a little bit of leeway from the Nazi soldiers because they found that he had that skill. He served useful for a while. So he got a little bit of leeway that way. Give you an idea, like the artwork here, you've probably seen a number of panels or a number of examples of this online. I don't know if it's been talked about too much in a while, but a few years ago this was pretty popular on BookTube. But as you can see, it's almost all in black and white. There is one page that has color. I mean, they show this on the back, but that's just on the cover. There is one page on here that has color, and it's actually the map of Auschwitz, I think they did in color. But it's sort of, a lot of it is in sort of muted color, so when you first look at it, it doesn't look like color at first, but then there's a bright red and yellow inset. The artwork was cute in parts. Wasn't always my thing. I will say, this one does take time to work through because, like, as you can see, there's a lot of text in this graphic novel. So I did notice though that the second half of the book seemed to go a little bit faster than the first half. Maybe because I was working through story setup in the first half, I'm not sure. But this was one of those ones that, like, when I came out of it, I felt like I was glad I read it. Glad I experienced it. There are definitely impactful themes in this book. It's not one that I feel like I could pick up again anytime soon, just because it did put me in a pretty sad mood the rest of the day after I read this. Which I know some people might be like, well, imagine how Jews feel. Which I know. Yeah. But still, very important to at least try once or twice in your reading experience. So that's what I had for the middle grade YA-ish, bordering on YA Holocaust fiction video. I finally got through all of those. And yeah, that's all I have for this video, guys. So feel free to leave me any comments down below, and we will talk soon. Bye, guys.
Hannah is dreaming, she's young once again. She stands with her brother, with thousands of men. Her head has been shaven by a black uniform. She's one of God's children that waits at the door.